Good evening. Welcome to the program. You're listening to the Soapbox here on 90.9, 104.1 WMPG, Southern Maine's community radio from the University of Southern Maine. My name is Eric Poulin. Thanks for joining me this evening. If you want to join the conversation, you're welcome to do so, 780-4909. And in the studio with me tonight, I have journalist and author Zack Anchors. Welcome, Zack.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
So we'll be talking about his recent article in was it the Boston Phoenix, the Portland Phoenix, or both?
The Portland Phoenix.
Okay. And the article is called "The Secret Trade Deal That Threatens Maine's Frail Economy." And before we jump in, I'll just mention, because I'm notoriously bad at this, but you can find a link to the article on the Soapbox's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/the Soapbox Portland. And I strongly recommend you check out the article. It's very important. So we'll just jump right into it. Zack, this article is about the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which is currently under negotiation in development. What is the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, it's a free trade agreement among Pacific Rim countries. So you've got the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and a few others. And it's kind of like NAFTA, which this month is the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. So it's a big trade deal that's meant to make it easier for exports and imports to pass through these back and forth between these countries. And it's a top priority of the Obama administration in his second term. And so it's being negotiated right now. They've been having negotiations for the last year, and it's expected to wrap up in the next month or so.
And so is this something that builds on what NAFTA had already begun, or is it sort of taking, in a different direction? Or
it's a completely new trade agreement.
Okay.
But it's just a similar structure. And so it's just one of several trade agreements that are being negotiated. So there's another one between the U.S. and the European Union, which is also a really big deal. But this one, the TPP, is just massive in geographic scope because it's got so many countries involved. It's got 40% of the world's GDP altogether. So it's just a massive deal. It'll have a huge impact on the global economy and just on people in each of the countries involved.
So let's get some of our terms here. So NAFTA is obviously the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Right.
And in the article, you mentioned a number of times USTR. Do you want to explain what that is?
Sure. That's the U.S. Trade Representative. So that's basically the top negotiator for the United States when it comes to trade agreements. And there's the USTR office. That's basically the whole office. That's political appointees, mostly appointed by Obama right now, who are negotiating these deals.
So maybe this is a naive question, but who sort of initiates a deal such as this? Is America primarily the driving force behind this, or is it NATO, or I don't know, not NATO, but like UN or something? Like, who brings these things?
Well, I think there's a push for it in each of the separate countries.
Okay.
But I mean, there's also these organizations like the World Trade Organization that have been pushing for a global agreement for quite a number of years. But there's been kind of a move away from the WTO global agreement towards just these regional partnerships. Like we've made a bunch of agreements recently one with Colombia, one with South Korea, one with Iceland in the last several years, and so that it's just easier to get an agreement among just a regional group of countries, and this is the kind of the biggest regional agreement so far.
And so the central idea, if you had to kind of sum it up behind this deal, is what?
Well, they say that the goal is to reduce trade barriers. That's pretty much the goal of all free trade agreements, is to reduce trade barriers, like tariffs.
Okay, so under the theory that it hurts our economy to have trade barriers with other countries, the converse is true, it helps our economy to have less barriers?
Well, the idea is that it helps everybody, that the whole world will be better off if there's low trade barriers. And so, goods can just move back and forth between countries without too many barriers. But I think the important thing to know about this trade agreement in particular is that it's really not that much about trade. It's really because there's actually not that many barriers to trade between the countries involved.
Mm-hmm.
So really what it's more about is making it easier for big businesses to operate in many different countries. It's making it easier for corporations to kind of follow the same playbook in every single country.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really about rewriting regulations and rules for doing business so that they apply to the whole world, or in this case to these 12 countries. But once we get a bunch of these agreements, it'll be the whole world.
So to benefit the downcast and downtrodden corporations, the lowly corporations, right?
Right.
So, which leads to the next question: who is involved in drawing up this deal? Who is involved in negotiating this deal on behalf of our country?
So it's the U.S. Trade Representative's office.
Okay.
But the U.S. Trade Representative has all these committees that advise it, and they've got 700 people who are what they call cleared advisors, who are part of these committees, and almost all of them, about 600 of the advisors to the trade representative, are representatives from big corporations, like the trade groups and executives from the world's largest corporations. And then there's also an intergovernmental panel, they call it, where you've got some state elected officials and people from NGOs and things like that, and an environmental committee with environmental advocates on it.
So stakeholders, presumably,
Right.
But it sounds like from the takeaway from your article seems to suggest that corporations and business interests have sort of an outsized interest, and say, labor, I'm not sure, are they even represented at the negotiating table as far as you know?
Well, I mean, none of these groups are actually represented at the negotiating table. They're not
Okay.
allowed to negotiate. But in terms of just advising the U.S. Trade Representative, there are some union folks that are involved, but they have a very, very small presence.
Okay. And who is Sharon England Treat? You can tell us a little bit about her.
Sure. So she's a state representative from Hallowell here in Maine, in the state legislature, and she's probably one of the only state-level elected officials to be one of the advisors to the trade representative. And so she's, she basically gets excerpts of the negotiated text, and she gets to give feedback on it. And so she's, one of the only people in Maine who's kind of that actively involved in the process.
And what has been her public take on this process? Is she generally for or against it? Has she expressed reserve or support?
Yeah, she's been very skeptical of the agreement. So she's been giving lots of talks and presentations in Maine and around the country, trying to raise awareness about some of the implications for our state and just really for the whole country and the world. And she's got she's been really great at highlighting some of the ways in which this agreement could specifically affect Maine.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to touch on some of those things?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it's hard to even know where to start because there's so many ways that it could impact the state. But one that she's talked about a lot, for example, is the impact on prescription drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the provisions in the agreement is going to make it really, really strengthen patent protections for pharmaceutical companies and for any companies with patents. But what that means is that it'll be much more difficult to get generic drugs because pharmaceutical companies will be able to extend their patents much longer on their drugs, which could lead eventually to drastic increases in prices.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Maine, we've got an aging population, and we've already spent a lot of money on prescription drugs. That's going to have a big impact.
Excuse me. And it's this trade deal also has similar impact, it sounds like, on entertainment products. Is that right? So it's going to make it more difficult or it's going to allow the production companies to retain the rights to some of these products more, or maybe you can explain it a little bit better.
Yeah, so it's going to have lots of implications for copyright law. And, for instance, it could threaten the fair use doctrine, which is basically the idea, a tradition in U.S. copyright law that you can use copyrighted materials for certain purposes, like educational purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also things like, it would make temporary digital copies of certain things illegal. So if you just kind of have a copy of something on your computer for a short time, that could be illegal. But just in general, too,
Like an article, like if I copied and pasted something from the New York Times or something,
right?
that might be illegal.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah, exactly. And just in general, everyone's experienced where you go to YouTube, say, and you look for some video and it's been removed due to violating copyright. This agreement, as it's written now, would make that much more common in many, many more different kinds of situations. The companies would just have much stronger control over materials and over materials created by artists and cultural products and whatnot.
I should say you're listening to the Soapbox on WMPG. I'm here with Zack Anchors. Wrote a recent article in the Phoenix about the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal currently being negotiated and its impact on Maine and the nation and the world, really. So where have Maine's representatives fallen on this? Have they vocalized opinions at all?
Yes, they've all been skeptical and concerned about this agreement. And the main reason why, which we haven't touched on, is because, and this is the reason why the TPP has gotten the most attention in Maine, is because it threatens jobs here in Maine. It specifically is known to threaten shoe manufacturing jobs, the New Balance factories here in Maine, because we've got some of the only domestic shoe production here that's left in the country here in Maine. And so our representatives have been especially worried about that because it's, jobs is the big political issue right now. And so they've been really focused on that. They haven't been as much focused on the other issues that we've been talking about so far, although that's not quite so true for Shelley Pingree. But in terms of Senators King and Collins and Michoud, they're really focused on the jobs aspect of it. But the big issue that's going to come before them is they're going to have a chance pretty soon to vote on what's called fast track authority, which would allow Obama to basically just approve this deal on his own without Congress being able to debate it or add amendments to the agreement.
So what is the purported benefit of fast tracking it from the perspective of the Obama administration?
Well, the Obama administration really wants to get this deal moved forward. I mean, their goal actually was to get it finished last year, so they're already behind that. And so they, without fast track authority, it's going to be really, really difficult to pull that off because it's going to get mired in Congress, and all the people who are concerned about it are going to come forward and
start talking about
it, basically, and it's going to really get on the public's radar. But if Congress gives Obama fast track authority, then he's going to be able to just quickly move this through and send it back so that it can be approved by all the other countries and it'll be finalized.
So, okay, that leads me to two questions. One, if there is such concern, and presumably some of it is valid in terms of the potential loss of jobs, the economy is at such a precarious point at this point. What is it in Obama's perspective that is the benefit of this deal? Why is he in such a hurry to get it through? I mean, why does he say it? I mean, because I think it's pretty safe to assume that he's helping corporate business interests. That's obviously my interpretation, is open to debate. But what is his public opinion? Because it looks like if you're conducting the negotiations in such secrecy and you have sort of outsized influence from the business interests who are going to be most affected by it, most benefit from this deal, what argument can he make for democratic or at least superficially democratic purposes to the people to say this is going to be in your interest?
Right. Well, I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that Obama's position on free trade agreements is very, very different now than it was during his campaign in 2008, his first campaign. In 2008, he campaigned on, he said as soon as he took office, he wanted to immediately call up President of Mexico and President of Canada and amend NAFTA. He said he didn't want free trade agreements for Wall Street. He wanted them for Main Street. He wanted to get corporations out of the negotiation process and bring in unions more. He said things such as that. And that's, of course, not at all what's happening with this agreement.
A lot of things that he said in 2008 are not at all happening. But so what brought about the change, as far as you can see?
Well, I think it's also for context, important to note that there's pretty much bipartisan support for free trade agreements. There has been, at least among the kind of political mainstream. So both, it's one of the few areas in which you get Republican and Democratic leaders basically coming together to offer support.
Well, one might make the argument. I mean, Noam Chomsky has pointed out that really America is unique among westernized democracies in that we nominally have two parties, but they're effectively the same party, the party of business interests, and they're two factions of the same party. But we're unique in the sense that we don't have a true labor party, a true party representing the interests of the people. I think, at various times in our history as a country, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have both kind of claimed that mantle to, varying degrees of legitimacy. But currently, there's really no one representing the interests of the people. So I guess it's not that surprising, to hear that they're both behind this pro-business international trade deal.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the opposition is also somewhat bipartisan, because you've got the Tea Party people like Rand Paul who are expressing serious concern and opposition, and then you've got progressive leaders like Elizabeth Warren, who's also opposed to this deal. And here in Maine, we've got people like Sharon England-Treat, who's a Democrat, and you've also got a lot of Republican elected officials in Maine here who are really concerned about this deal, and that it's going to threaten the state's sovereignty to pass laws and regulations.
And that kind of goes to one of the themes we talk about frequently here on the Soapbox, is that these differences between ideology in the political parties, left and right, Democrat, Republican, I think are really falling by the wayside. I think the whole framing of political discussion and debate in this country, I think, needs to change to more reflect the fact that it's the working people, real everyday working Americans, and then the business class, the corporate ruling elites. But Ed, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, we had a caller from Buxton who couldn't stay on the line. He was wanting to know, wanting to discuss some of the environmental aspects of this, because they seem to loom large on the horizon if this comes through with mining and lumbering and et cetera. And want to know if you address that a little bit, or
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, and so today actually the environment chapter of the agreement was leaked to WikiLeaks, and so we have a much more ability to know what is actually in the agreement today than we did yesterday, and I think that's something we haven't mentioned yet. I think is that everything in the agreement so far is top secret, can't be discussed at all by anybody, and can't be seen by the public. But fortunately, 5 chapters have been leaked so that we can see them and read them. And
Zach, can I just jump in real quick? A quick aside, and I definitely want to address the environmental issue. I think it's important, but why is it so secret? I don't understand why they would be so interested in keeping it so secret. Do you have any idea?
Well, it's just like with any high-level negotiations. They say that secrecy allows them more kind of flexibility in negotiations, and traditionally there has been some secrecy. There's been quite a bit of secrecy surrounding these trade agreements, but there's been even more in this case than in some recent other agreements.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because they've got 12 countries here with very different stakes, and it's going to be very difficult to get an agreement that everyone can agree to, and especially since they're doing things that much of the American public is going to find very objectionable, and going to be very concerned about. And so I think the only way that they're going to get this trade agreement through is if they do hide it from the public and prevent a lot of public discussion of it.
Okay, 780-4909. Thanks for that question. Now to the environment. You talk a little bit about fracking and some of the other impacts on the environment, and jump back to this leak that just came out.
Sure, yeah. So there's an environmental chapter which actually makes an effort to make some progress on some environmental areas. But really, I think the most important environmental issues that come up in this agreement are having to do with other areas. Like, for instance, one big impact that could come out of this is that there could be an increase in the production of natural gas, because this agreement can make it much easier for the United States to export natural gas to other countries, which right now is quite difficult to do. And so that would probably lead to a big increase in production and more fracking here in the U.S. And it could also just create more pressure for an LNG terminal here in Maine or other,
what is that? The LNG terminal?
liquefied natural gas.
Okay.
So for many years, there's been proposals to build such a terminal on the coast of Maine, so that it would just be easier to get natural gas produced in the U.S. out of the state to other markets. But I think another really big issue to highlight in the agreement is this provision that would allow corporations and private entities to basically sue governments if they perceive that there's a regulation or a law that violates the treaty and that hinders them from profiting off an investment. So basically, let's say that a company found that a state law here in Maine was preventing them from profiting off creating profits. They could actually sue the United States under the treaty, and a private tribunal would be held, and there would have to be, and the United States could be found to be violating the treaty, and it could have to pay up.
And
so
this would operate outside of the American judicial system. This
right,
tribunal
exactly.
would be
And so the same thing was included under NAFTA. So it's not really anything new. And there's been many cases under NAFTA. For instance, just not too long ago, a company sued the province of Quebec, or sued Canada because the province of Quebec had a moratorium on fracking. And so Quebec Canada had to pay up a multi-million-dollar settlement. So here in Maine, for instance, the South Portland moratorium on the tar sands shipments. That's the type of rule that could be challenged using this investor-state dispute settlement.
So through such a tribunal, could they ever coerce a state or a government into doing what it is that they have decided not to do, or is it strictly limited to sort of financial fees and fines based on the loss of profits?
Well, what it could do is what would happen is that it would discourage governments from passing laws that could be challenged. So it would be whether it's a city council or a state government. They don't want to get challenged. They don't want their laws to be. They don't want to be see their laws challenged and the country to be taken to a tribunal like this, and so they're going to be less likely to pass these kinds of laws and aggressive regulations.
Boy, that seems really insane to me. So you have sovereign governmental institutions supposedly representing the people of their countries being superseded in power by corporate business interests who are exercising that power in private tribunals outside of the normal judicial system.
Right. I mean, the idea is that everybody should be playing by the same rules, and so that, this trade agreement is going to make it so that a company can operate in Vietnam and they can operate in the U.S. and they have some basic idea of that both countries are going to have the same level of sort of protections and regulations. So it's supposed to kind of what they call harmonize regulations. But the question is whether it's going to sort of harmonize up or down. Is it going to lower the standards, or is it going to raise the standards? And it's looking like in a lot of important environmental areas, it's going to lower the standards.
Well, and Zach, it strikes me that we've had some of these sort of globalization trade agreements in place for some time, right? So there is a history to sort of conjecture forward on what the consequences might be. And since we've had these moves towards globalization, we've had a dramatic increase in inequality, certainly in this country, but also around the world. We've had, global economic catastrophe. Do you see these as at all connected? Do you think that there's, that this portends badly for the future in terms of harmonizing down instead of harmonizing up these regulations?
Well, I think in general, I think that there's a lot of evidence that NAFTA in particular and other trade agreements have increased and exacerbated the problem of inequality, of growing inequality, and they've certainly been great for corporations and for people with lots of capital, and not so great for working class people, and particularly certain kinds of people. I mean, the kind of least privileged people in Mexico, for instance, with NAFTA. I mean, lots of farmers lost their land. It really led to really pushed a lot of migrant workers to move north into the U.S. And so there have been winners and losers, certainly, and free trade agreements have produced a lot of economic growth. There's no doubt, but it's a question of where the fruits of that economic growth were distributed.
Right.
And it's been mostly towards the top.
Yeah. Well, and this movement to sort of see a sort of a harmony on a global scale in terms of economy seems sort of foolhardy, doesn't it? Because different nations have different currencies have different values relative to the societies within those nations. And I mean, we've seen with the euro in Europe, the problems that can come with having one currency across borders like that. And it seems to me, I mean, a problem with globalization is that, if we are competing on a global market in terms of manufacturing, and we're competing with a country who has no standards of, labor laws or regulations of minimum wage or anything like that, they can, have people in sweatshops essentially making goods that they're going to sell in this country, that we can't compete with manufacturing in this country because we got to pay people minimum wage. Of course, some people would say that we need to get away with throw out the minimum wage for that. I would say we need to do the opposite and make sure that everyone, if we're going to have some sort of international global trade agreement, seems to me we need to go from the bottom up. Right. And make sure that the standards of living and labor laws are raised, so that people have enough money to buy these goods around the world. But
and I mean, I think that you theoretically could use a free trade agreement like this to raise a lot of standards, and that's sort of being done through this agreement, but not successfully. To bring it back to the environmental chapter actually does. The U.S. has put a lot of really productive and great provisions in there. Like, for instance, banning certain kinds of unsustainable timber harvesting or unsustainable fishing practices. And so it would be great if all these countries could agree to that. But the problem is that the U.S., and what the leaked chapter showed today, is that the U.S. is not willing to actually really fight for those provisions. And, of course, other countries are very resistant to them, too. And so, the U.S. is willing to fight for the things that corporations are asking for, but they're not willing to really fight and put themselves on the line for say,
people
policies for people, for the environment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good, if bleak, place to end the conversation. Please do check out the article. It's linked again on the Soapbox's Facebook page, which you can find at facebook.com/thesoapboxportland. Thank you very much to Zack Anchors for being here, and hopefully you'll come back sometime and we can talk about some other stuff that you write.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks for listening. Have a good night. Oh, stick around for Byron here on WMPG, and thanks to Ed.
To read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so.